Ethical language is problematic, says G.E. Moore, because actually it doesn't really get us anywhere. If I say, what is good? The reply can only be, what is good is morally right. And what is morally right? What does that mean? It means that's what good is. So we get in this circle where we can't really explain the word good without reference to other words. And so people like Bentham define good as pleasure. People like Fletcher define good as love. People like Aquinas define good as what fulfills our purpose, etc., etc. And these are what we call naturalistic ethics. In other words, observations of the world and making decisions on what is good by observing the world. This is problematic for G.E. Moore. G.E. Moore says that the biggest problem with this is that actually you're bringing in words to the meaning of good, which aren't necessarily the case. He says, if we ask a question, why is love good? Why is pleasure good? We can always have the answer, I don't know, I can't prove it to you. That is what he calls the open question argument. We can always ask why certain things are good. And because we can do that, it reveals two problems with ethical language. Two problems. Number one, the naturalistic fallacy. It is a fallacy to refer to good with reference to other things. Why? Because there's nothing within the definition of the word good that says pleasure is good, that love is good, whatever it is. That's the first problem, is a fallacy to do that. Secondly, it leads us to the is-ought problem. If I define what good is, for instance, pleasure, then just because pleasure is good, or that's what I've decided pleasure is, then it doesn't mean that therefore we ought to carry that out. So if I said the walls are white, that's an observation. But then to say the walls should be white does not follow. I'm turning a descriptive statement into a prescriptive statement, and G.E. Moore says it's a leap in logic. It's unacceptable, it's not appropriate. So the second problem with ethical language is the is-ought problem. Now, G.E. Moore proposes a solution. He says that we know what yellow is, and we know what good is. We know what many things are. Innumerable objects of thought, he says, cannot be broken down without reference to other things. And just as yellow can be known, we know what yellow is, but yet we cannot describe it. We can also do the same with good. We use our intuition to tell us what is good. But we can't define good, because then we'd be committing the naturalistic fallacy and the is-ought problem. So actually, we just need to use our intuition. And one man's intuition may be better than another's. It's not appropriate to tell that person or to even explain why that's the case, because actually then we would be defining good. But nonetheless, there is an objective standard of goodness of which we can relate through our intuition and we can act out of. So that's intuitionism as a response G.E. Moore. He doesn't really come up with a sophisticated system. So we have Pritchard and Ross who do that later, and you can read about that yourself. Emotivism is a completely different response to the problems of ethical language. Emotivism says, no, the reason we can't define good without reference to other things is because it doesn't exist. Intuitionism says we can't do it because it's inappropriate, there are problems with language, but it does exist objectively. Emotivism says, no, we can't define good with reference to other things, without reference to other things, because there's no such concept. This is air. This is the verification principle. There are three types of statements. There are those statements that can be tested as true, there's those types of statements that can be tested as false, and there are those kind of statements that cannot be tested at all, that are meaningless. And therefore, if a statement is meaningless, it shouldn't even be considered. Ethical statements are meaningless because they cannot be tested. What is good? Well, we can't test that empirically, and therefore it must be discarded as completely meaningless. So all we're left with emotivism is that ethical statements and language about good and bad and evil and things like that are completely meaningless, which some people and many people cannot accept. So the Holocaust, he reduces to a boo kind of emotional response. They're just emotional responses to things that happen. They are not objective standards of goodness, and they don't reflect any kind of content, says H.A.M. And this is developed later by Stevenson, and you can read about that yourself, and also prescriptivism, R.M. Hare, and you can read about that yourself. So the key problems with ethical language, as G.E. Moore reveals, is that we cannot define good without reference to other things. And if we do that, we're committing the naturalistic fallacy. And the is-all problem. Intuitionism is a response that says, no, there is a standard of goodness, an objective standard of goodness, we just simply cannot explain or describe what that is. We know through our intuition. Emotivism, in complete contrast, says, no, the reason we cannot explain what good is because it doesn't exist. It's an emotional response and nothing more.